Okay, welcome everybody. It's a little bit past 3 o'clock in the Netherlands. Welcome to another Hot Politics Lab meeting. Today we have the honor to have a special guest from Israel named Waismel-Manor. Who was supposed to be here in Amsterdam, but unfortunately due to the pandemic that did not play out. But we just discussed that this rendezvous might actually happen later in the spring. So that is nice. We were just discussing why it's nice to have a speaker series because Israel just told me that he's starting his own political behavior lab with a speaker series in Haifa because that's where he's based. One of the advantages is that you get to meet people that you maybe occasionally know by name, or you've read some of their papers. I remember reading your early 2011 cortisol paper, and then you interact a little bit with each other on Twitter, but you don't really know who the person is. And the nice thing about our speaker series is that we have the chance to invite people and learn something about their work. And I'm really excited about having Israel here with us today because if you look at his CV, it's a rich, diverse set of questions related to public opinion that he studies, publishes in leading journals in political science and communication, as well as public opinion research. So really nice and broad range of methods and questions that he studies. And I'm particularly excited about the project that he will talk about today with the title called From Corruption to Cyberspace, Expanding What We Study and How We Study It. Israel, it's very nice to meet you, and I'm going to hand over the floor to you. Gijs will do the Q&A. For those of you who are a little new here, type your questions in the Q&A box, and then Gijs will read them out loud. That's it for now. Israel, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much for the invite. I really like this opportunity. It's unfortunate that I cannot do it in person. And at first, because we thought it's going to be in person, we thought it's going to be a bit more kind of hands-on, or perhaps get into more the nitty-gritty of doing research. So I'll try to do that with two papers that I'll discuss today, a bit an oldie and a new one. And I would really appreciate your comments, especially where I can take them to, or perhaps you want to take them to some new adventures for your own research. Can I share the screen? All right. All right. So the thing with as Bert said, the thing with my Vita is that I'm quite diverse because I get bored very fast, and I always am looking for other things to do. And I was blessed, I think, that at least when I was studying at Cornell doing my PhD, I had a committee. You probably know Dieter Scheuffel, but the others were political scientists, and Ted Lowy and Walter Maben, and all of them were like very supportive in saying, look, do whatever you want. You have crazy ideas, just follow them. And if you enjoy that, go with it. Even if it takes a bit longer, at least you enjoy the ride. And since then, I've been doing more or less the same thing. And I like pursuing weird stuff because I think that's the most interesting part. That's what you're doing in your own lab, which is amazing that every week you have speakers, and not just from political science, you have psychologists and people from physiology and others that come and engage with you. So let me start talking about the recent paper. I'll devote a bit more time to it, and then I'll go back to a cyber paper. So this paper about corruption is a cooperation with Patricia Moy, Rico Newman, and Moran Shechnik, who is a PhD student at Haifa. And we began this project out of a concern that I had many years ago. We had in my department, we have one of the leading scholars on corruption in Israel, and perhaps even the world, in terms of normative thinking about corruption and legally thinking about corruption. But my quarrel with this guy, Doron Navot, was always that he was focusing on grand corruption and the effect it may have, the fact that Netanyahu took, again, $4 million, or that Ehud Olmert took 50,000 shekels to fly around the world. So those are the things that concern him because it can topple a government and so forth. But to me, that's the least interesting part about corruption. What to me was fascinating, and I always wanted to get at, was to try and understand if corruption corrupts, because that's the real price. does the exposure to corruption lead people to be more corrupt in their daily lives? And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, we're talking about, very common in South America that you pay the police officer, you tell the police officer, can I pay the fine here instead of in the mail? And it's very common to do so. In Israel, it's very common that you give a doctor a present before or after the treatment. People selling things without reporting their taxes, the same for taxi drivers. So it's very common all across the world, perhaps less in the Netherlands, but definitely in the Middle East it is. And we also are exposed to many cases of corruption. So this happens in Canada, it happens in the United States, especially at the municipal level. It happens in Israel with prime ministers, with other countries as well. And we were thinking of trying to decipher and understand whether, first of all, can a monetary incentive lead people to behave unethically? So there's a strand of research that's been followed since Tversky and Kahneman, later Dan Ariely and others, and in which people were exploring the fact that yes, if I give you a monetary incentive, there is a chance that you'll behave unethically in some way. So first of all, we want to confirm that in our own study. Then we want to see if there's a trait to corrupt people. Are people that are corrupt different from other people, and what can we learn about them? So we know that men are typically more corrupt than women, that it's more likely that in right-wing governments we'll see more corrupt cases developing. We see that people with low education are usually indifferent towards corruption. We see that religious societies, usually more traditional societies, have higher levels of corruption. So we wanted to see if we can find who these people are. And finally, and that's what was really bugging us, was to see whether exposure, and we know from cultivation theory onwards and works on copycats, that people who are viewing corruption, people who are exposed, not corruption, sorry, to behaviors on TV are more likely to copy them, to legitimize them, to think that's the norm. And that was my big thing, that I really wanted to get at an answer to this question. The problem is that, well, first of all, in terms of Israel, so Israel is a good case to study corruption because we're not doing very well in terms of our scores. Leading Transparency International, actually, the new score came 2 days ago or 3 days ago, and we went down another spot downwards. So there's prevalent corruption in Israel in terms of government. We had cases of, obviously, the ongoing investigation that you may have heard about. Benjamin Netanyahu is currently on trial for many breaches of trust and corruption and fraud. We have a prime minister, the former prime minister, Ehud Olmert, who went to jail for corruption. We have a minister of interior who went to jail for 7 years for corruption, and now he had to resign again because he was caught again doing corrupt things, and he resigned this week again from the Knesset. And on top of that, Israel has a higher level of tax evasion. So about 22% of the GDP is unreported. It's not as bad as Greece, but we have a shadow economy in which people tend to not report some of their income. And to me, this is much more costly to the state than the 3 million or 4 million that Netanyahu may have stole or not. Plus, it may affect people in their levels of trust, willingness to serve in the military, willingness to vote, etc., etc. Now, the problem was for me, and I've been struggling with this, to be honest, since around 2008. I've been trying to figure out a way to get a behavioral measure of corruption, and it was really difficult. I've hammered my head against the wall for many years. The original design was supposed to be that I bring people to the lab, and after they complete a survey in which they were exposed to corruption, I, by mistake, drop a 20 shekel bill on the floor, and if they pick it up and they return it, then I have a measure. But this was very complicated. But eventually, with the advancement of web surveys, I came up with what I think is a neat solution to the problem. And the design goes as following. We shot two identical ads. The ads are just a news bulletin of about 3 minutes in which you get just the headlines. So there's a car accident, there's the mayor is convicted of corruption, or the mayor opens a new factory in town. And then you have a story about the prime minister of Iceland saying that Trump is hurting the environment and the weather. And we asked people, if we lied to the people, to the respondents. We told them, look, you're going to participate in a study that tries to see in the age of multiple screens if people can still retain information from watching TV. Please watch carefully this news segment. There's going to be 10 questions. If you answer the whole 10 questions correctly, you're going to get about $15 reward, in addition to what you get for completing the survey. So it's a decent amount of money. It's not a lot, but it's definitely a shawarma and a Coke. And the thing was that the questions were some open-ended, some closed-ended. So we asked, what's the color of the blazer of the anchor? And by the way, this is Moran. This is my student. She's a reporter, and so she shot the whole things herself. So it's very professionally done in the Channel 1 News studio. So we asked them a few questions, the stories, how many people died in the accident, and so forth. And every time, no matter what you answer, the screen tells you, great, you did 8 out of 8. You did 7 out of 7. You're doing great. You're about to get the prize. The 9th question is a question that asks, what's the name of the Prime Minister of Iceland? The only difficulty for people to answer is that it's not mentioned in the article, in the news. So to do so, you have to actually do Google and find the name of this person. And we told them, you're not allowed to Google, you're not allowed to watch the video again, just from your memory. And we call this design, actually the name came from Patricia Moy, who's great with acronyms. We called it BUSTED. So behaviors uncovered in simulated tests exposing deception. So we have a 2x2. In one case, you see the mayor who's corrupt and indicted. In one case, you see the mayor just opening a new factory. And in one case, you get the money. And in the other case, in the other group, you don't get money for completing it correctly. You just get well done for doing the job done. And that's it. So what did we find? First of all, we found that giving money does create unethical behavior. So I wouldn't call it corruption, but it's unethical behavior. So people cheated. About 30% of the sample, we had about 100 respondents per condition. So 30 people in the corrupt case, and a monetary incentive did behave unethically. In the control group, we have about the same number. It's not statistically significant. And when you don't give money to people to behave unethically, they usually don't behave unethically, although some people still think that they need to get the answer right. It was funny, some of the people butchered the name on purpose, like they Googled, but they said, like, I think it's something like Jorgensen or Vargensen or something like that. And they just copied it from English. So that's for the first question. So it does create unethical behavior. As for the second question, we were only able to confirm that people who voted for right-wing parties tend to be more corrupt. It makes sense also in Israel because Netanyahu is from a right-wing party, and if your leader can do it, then so can you. If you're from the left, you're unethically, you align yourself with unethical behavior if you were to behave corrupt because it's not your leader. You're against Netanyahu, and therefore you should be aware of being corrupt like the person you despise. Finally, coming to the exposure, unfortunately, exposure, at least, and unfortunately, because we wanted to find it, obviously nobody wants to find the null finding, but in Israel, at least, exposure to corruption does not lead people to behave unethically. But we kind of think, why would that be the case? We think that that may be the case because corruption is the third most covered topic in Israeli politics. it gets sometimes more coverage than the Hamas or terrorism or the territories, especially in the last few years in which Netanyahu has been under investigation and now under criminal court procedures. You cannot open a newsreel, newscast, or a blog or newspaper in which there's no coverage of corruption. So we suspect that by adding just one story about corruption to our subjects, it doesn't prime them to think about corruption more than they already have in the past. Hopefully, we would like to take this to another place where we can actually investigate it in a place perhaps like the Netherlands or perhaps other places that corruption is not that prevalent, and see what we find there. And additionally, we think that perhaps this method, this busted method, could be used as an independent variable for other studies, and I'll be curious to see later what you think about it. Let me move to something a bit more crazy, and that's cyber attacks. So the same question came to our brains here in the process. Was started by Daphne Canetti and Michael Gross and myself, and we started playing with this idea together. And then Asaf Levanon and Hagit Cohen joined to this endeavor. And our idea here was that there's a lot of discussion, and probably you see it all the time in your news as well, that coverage of cyber attacks is mostly done through an economic lens, in which, okay, how much money did this company lose? How much was their ransom? The factory was shut down for 4 days, things of the sort. Nobody talks about what cyber attacks can do to individuals. What will the impact of a cyber attack be on the public, and how will the public react after a cyber attack? Because we're talking about something that happens almost daily, not almost daily, it happens daily. So when people think about cyber attacks, usually they have this knowledge of a few kids in this basement that are doing some mischievous stuff, they're changing their grades. But in reality, cyber attacks today are much more state-oriented. They are done by units like 8200 in Israel, by special units, the IRA in Russia and others. And these are major concerns because of the capabilities of these units is quite astonishing. In terms of the level of attack or the quantity that we suffer, so the estimation is that Israel itself suffers from around 100,000 attacks daily, okay, from many sources. It could be a kid with a computer, but it could be also from the Iranians or the Hamas or anonymous, or perhaps even in groups within Israel that are attacking certain political elements or economic elements. Now, in terms of the consequences, we were really concerned that people who are suffering an attack, and again, we're not talking about an attack, let's say you have an attack on a hospital and the power grid falls and somebody dies in the ER. We're not talking about that kind of attack. We're talking about an attack that affects you individually, personally, at your computer or at your home. And we were afraid that such an attack will lead people to kind of into this mass mentality that we need to retaliate or we need to take action against whoever the perpetrators are of the attack. So in terms of the effects, so obviously we're not dealing here with kinetic terrorism, in which we talk about the loss of lives, which is a different kind of thing. As somebody who was around 50 meters from a car that exploded once, I can tell you it's a completely different thing. But we're talking about something that's still quite serious. The last two brackets that you see here, when the attack is against either computers or personal attacks, they may lead people to mistrust, to fear, anxiety, stress, irrational behavior, and so forth. And that's what we're getting at. And again, here, the thing was to try and see what the effect is. And we know from previous studies that cyberbullying and other kind of attacks can lead to lots of negative effects on individuals from PTSD, from depression, insecurity, mistrust, and so forth. The question is, again, how to do it behaviorally, and that's what we try to find a way to solve it. So what we did was the following. We invited students to my office, which was, again, we didn't have a lab, and we still don't have a lab, so my office was the lab, and we have a shortage of rooms. So students were invited to my room, and there was an RA there, and we told them, look, this is a study of public diplomacy, and we believe that by sending messages of love and cooperation to other people through Facebook, you're going to elevate your oxytocin, which is the love hormone. That's what we told them. And we want to see if that love hormone, because you engage with somebody from Indonesia or Malaysia or something, your love hormone will rise and it's going to give you a good feeling. That was the story. So they were asked to come to the lab, and they were supposed to post something positive about Israel on Facebook. And obviously we measured a lot of attitudinal, psychological, and physiological measures. And actually we didn't measure oxytocin, we were measuring cortisol. Now we randomly assigned them to one of two groups. One group just completed the whole study, but there was no attack. The other group, the treatment group, was attacked, and I'll show you the attack in a second. At the end, we asked them to continue completing a survey that was as long as eternity. It was 25 minutes just to get them. The cortisol has a peak of 25 minutes after a treatment, and therefore we wanted to delay their stay at the lab. So we asked them to rate the attractiveness of Angela Merkel, of Netanyahu, of other people. How nice is Angela Merkel? How nice is Schroeder? How nice is, I don't know, Tony Blair? I don't know. I don't remember the leaders, but it was something that took forever, kind of neutral, mechanical. And then we tested again their cortisol and a lot of measures, psychological measures. Now, to do the design, we teamed up with Hagit Cohen. Hagit Cohen usually works on stress with rats. So that's her thing. So she does stress among rats. And we thought, hey, our students are kind of the equivalent. And seriously, it gave us some bona fides among the IRB people that this is a serious matter, and this is something that should be studied, because it was really hard to get the IRB for what I'm going to show you. So at first they're doing their survey, and suddenly the screen goes blank, black, and they see this note here that basically says with the Cyrillic and Hebrew letters, we are anonymous, the information belongs to all of us, even your computer. And this is in the lab, right? It's not in their computer, it's the lab computer, but still. So imagine what would happen if this were to happen at home. So at the lab computer, we don't forget and we don't forgive. In a few more seconds, we're going to get even to your cellular phone. Expect us. And the student, the screen is freezing. You cannot type anything, and the array is there, and the array is kind of like, you know your studies from the 1950s. Oh, this is just a glitch. You know, it's a computer in the lab. We have lots of viruses here. So please, I get paid for you to complete the study. Please continue the study. And she presses some kind of combination in the keyboard, and it starts again. So they continue the study. And after 2 minutes, what happens is that a pop-up screen opens, kind of like a Skype one, in which they see a guy with a hoodie typing and themselves live. So it goes live. And again, oh my God, this is so wrong. I want to stop. No, please don't stop. Continue the study. This is an important study. Just keep at it. And eventually, after 2 minutes, again, they get. We ask them to leave their phones on the desk on vibrate. They get a message on their personal phones in which they get a message that says, "This is anonymous. We have all your connections. We got to you." So that was the procedure. We had a few people say, "I need to call the police." And we told them, sure, call the police, but after you complete the study, we just need to complete the study, and then you can call whoever you want. By the way, we had a procedure at the end, the debriefing, that included a counseling for those who were afraid. So it was it was taken care of. Only one person really was insistent on calling the police when we had to tranquilize them a bit and say, look, this is us and not. So what happened? The problem with the study was that our N is a bit small, so the effect size are not that great, but they are in the expected direction. So those people exposed to cyber terrorism, and again, this is a computer, a public computer, it's not their own computer. They elevated their cortisol, and people were in the control group. Cortisol is very diurnal, so it lowers significantly during the day. So we were able to record the decline in cortisol in the control group. When it comes to psychological measures, so again, the group that using the STI inventory, so this is state anxiety inventory. So on the left, you see, I'm worried, I'm upset, I'm tense. So the experiment group, yes, is more worried, upset, and tense. And on the right side, you see, I'm content, I'm serene, I'm calm. And you see that that's a decline. So I think this is a nice finding. In terms of attitudes, surprisingly, we were thinking that people after being attacked, they're going to say, okay, let's go and bring down whatever, the evildoers. And we didn't see that. Most of the effects here are very small. And again, it's hard to come up with a complete picture, but people do want the government to take care of them. So the state must tell me if my computer was attacked. It must force business to defend to put a software there to defend our businesses, and so forth. It could be the case that it's because the attack was from anonymous and it wasn't from Iran or from Syria. We could have gotten perhaps different results if the attack was from an hostile country and not from an organization. Although it's a small sample, we were quite confident on our results because we did really allocate people randomly, and we have the pre and post design with the same subjects, and we did follow up with people. And in the interviews after the experiment, people were really concerned for their information. Many reported even weeks after, because they are students, they reported that they changed all their passwords. They installed things on their computer like firewalls that would be stronger because they became more conscious of the danger. So we feel good about that. But still, this was very preliminary, and I think this should be explored even further. So I'm all ready for questions, and perhaps I'll stop the share, and I hope I'm okay with time.
Thanks a lot, Israel. This is a super fascinating set of studies. There were at least two big wows here in the room, and I'd like to start with a clarification question. In this last study, when exactly did the respondents, the participants, realize that this was a mock procedure?
Oh, they didn't. They didn't realize. So we did a post-mortem with each interviewer. So the whole thing took about 40 minutes, and we left 20 minutes just to debrief them and make sure that, and none of them thought that this was fake. None of them. They all took it seriously. Again, to the point that they were quite nervous about it, and they felt bad about it. And we asked them individually, because they are students, they had a motivation to actually shut their mouths, not to talk to their friends about this. And we told them there's going to be a date in class in which we'll discuss this. So please do not talk about it with your peers, because all of them are invited throughout the week for this study.
Well, there's at least a great policy implication from your study that if we want to prevent war breaking out between Israel and Iran, we should get all Israelis hacked by anonymous, because they seem to be less on wage war. There's a question here in the room from the anonymous.
Yes, hello, Israel. Thank you for this heartbreaking, or maybe I should say breathtaking presentation. I have like a practical question about like the ethical approval of this study. So in our university here, it would have been quite difficult actually to obtain approval for such a study, because one would have to use quite a high level of anxiety to participants. And this might be something that would go against the ethical protocols here in place. So I wonder like whether you had some specific steps taken in the debriefing procedure to sort of ameliorate these sort of symptoms or this sort of anxiety from your participants. And another practical question I have about this study concerns the SMS that was sent to their mobile phones, whether there was a way to ensure that it was only that SMS, that notification message that popped in while the participants were participating in the study, and not anything else random, like from message.
You didn't get the second question. Can you repeat that, or somebody repeat it?
Yes. So the second question is about how did you ensure that the participants would only receive your message, the manipulation message, I mean, in their phone, and not just a random message from a friend during participating?
Good. It's a good point. So let me start with the second one. It's not WhatsApp, it's a text message, and text messages in Israel are very uncommon. Usually you would get them, let's say, if you do a COVID test and the state informs you that you have COVID, you get it through a text message. But other than that, I think I only get it like, I get a couple of months in terms of text messages. So we were hopeful that, but they could check it. We didn't, most students, we told them when we saw the RA was told to tell the students, when this vibrates, you can tell the student, if the student didn't pick it himself, the RA told them, oh, you can look at the message, that's fine. And then they saw the message. Plus we knew when the RA was the one that sent the message. So it was a software that we wrote, a little code that we wrote that allowed the RA, when she saw that 2 minutes passed from the previous, from the Skype screen, that they get the message. So she knew when to send the message out. So I hope that clarifies that element. In terms of ethical concerns, a ton of them. So this took a while to get through the system. I think the way to go about it started with that paper that Bert talked about, that I started. That's what paper was from 2011 about voting and cortisol, was the first one that I did with something that's a bit unethical to some degree for some. And in that case, again, we worked with Hagit Cohen and Professor Ifergan, both of them from a medical school, and it was easier for the IRB team here to understand that this is supervised by talented people that are experts on the field. So I think it's worthwhile to bring people over, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, an MD, that will give you some gravitas to your study and will assure the people from the social sciences that are in the IRB committee that you're not playing just for fun and doing this for game. An additional element that really helped is that we were able to convince in the IRB that this is serious stuff. This is not just for the fun of it. We're not really trying to understand if, I don't know, even things that I do, like people who are more dominant get more elected. This is really about the lives of people, individuals, and their safety, and the policy implications, as you said, are tremendous. And we wanted to make sure that is conveyed to the committee, that this is not a game, this is serious stuff, and we think that there's a real reason to go with these studies. So once we did that, and we included a protocol of debriefing, and we included a protocol with a psychologist for any person that required so, each student got a telephone with the information of a psychologist on our behalf. We pay for it. If he feels anxiety, if he feels weird, feel free to call. It's free, we pay for it, don't worry, and nobody did.
Very brief suggestion regarding the first set of studies that you showed us, which I found very interesting, on corruption. I'm not sure if you are familiar with, but perhaps not. There is this line of work in psychology where people have been using the DICE paradigm if that sounds any familiar. If it doesn't, you may take a look at this because it's a really nice behavioral measure on corruption. And there's a nice paper by Olson, 2019 paper, that gives a nice overview of this paradigm. I think it's a nice perhaps addition to this set of studies.
Thank you. I would love to see them. I don't recall right now, but again, it may be that this COVID is getting me, but who knows?
Yeah. Okay. We're going to another question in the Q&A box, and for those of you new here today, you can write your questions in the Q&A box, and in Israel you can also read the question that Matthijs Roda has asked. Hi Israel, thank you for these interesting and thought-provoking presentations. I have a question about the first study. Your third hypothesis was that exposure to corruption leads to more willingness to engage in corruption. Your explanation for finding no effect here is that people in Israel are strongly pre-treated because corruption stories are widespread. I would like to suggest another explanation and would like to ask you what you think about it. Could it be that some people will indeed copy corrupt behavior after being exposed to such a message, your copycat explanation, but that others instead will be repulsed by the corruption story and therefore less likely to engage in corrupted behavior? Could it be that both effects take place and cancel each other out, leading to no overall effect in the study?
Thank you. That's great, and I think that it could be the case, but unfortunately, it could happen regardless of my treatment. In general, I think that's what we saw with right-wing and left-wing audience. The people that think, and in Israel, it's the hottest topic of the last 2 years. The elections were basically, the last 4 elections were about the rule of Netanyahu and whether he's a corrupt politician or not. And that's what we talk about every day. The protests were weekly throughout this period all across the country. So I think that overall, what we should expect to see is right-wingers saying, well, is corrupt maybe, but is my corrupt? There's that notion in South America that I'm originally from Argentina, and they're saying in Argentina is es corrupto, pero es mi corrupto. It's mine, and therefore I don't think that there's any unethical behavior in it if you corrupt to help your tribe or your group. And actually, there's some interesting work done. I don't know if you know this kind of popular book, Weird People. It's a book about white, economically developed, industrialized nations. And you see that in weird countries, being the West, corrupt behavior is not well received, but in many other countries around the world, you're actually expected by your peers to be corrupt to save or to help your community. So it's expected of you to actually help your tribe member to enter the university if you're an admission professor over other talented people because that's your group. So I think perhaps it would be better if the next study would increase the number of respondents, and then after controlling for the political affiliation in a non-corrupt country, we'll be able to see if the corrupt trigger does something.
Yes, thanks, Israel. Then there's another comment by one of our Indian students, Navodita Pandey, and she writes that in India, corruption is often talked about ahead of elections, and how almost every citizen wants to get rid of it. There was even an anti-corruption movement that went viral on social media in 2011, but it all feels a sham as the political party, the abbreviation is AAP, which means monkey in Dutch, which came up to remove corruption, is actually winning votes, but also thriving on corrupt practices themselves. Yeah, what's your reflection on that?
Well, many people talk about anti-corruption initiatives. Even Netanyahu speaks about anti-corruption. He was the one who persecuted Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister, for the corruption charges, and says, and there's a nice quote by Netanyahu, says that anybody investigated for corruption should resign from government and relinquish his throne until the allegations are explored. And obviously he failed to do so when he was a prime minister. So one could be very anti-corruption because it's like, who's for better pay for our teachers? Okay, it's something that's normative. Most people would say, yes, I'm for less corruption. But on the other hand, I believe that for some people, corruption can be, or at least unethical behavior could be a means to an end. And if the end justifies it, be it $15 in payment that you could put to good use, or by helping a relative or somebody from your group advance in life, then some people may see corruption differently than we see it in the West.
Thanks, Israel. I wanted to ask you to reflect a bit more on the position of the research assistants. I mean, in some ways, there are analogies between your study and the Milgram experiment, in which it was eventually established that the research assistants played a big role, and so I mean, I can imagine trying to imagine being a participant in your study, and I would be personally surprised if this thing would happen on the computer that is owned by university, and then this research assistant telling me to continue. Can you, and I also in that line wondering, was there one research assistant, were there multiple research assistants? As a whole, could you reflect a bit more on this position?
Sure. So there were two research assistants, so they worked together, and the allocation was that each would get a whole day. So there would be less variation in terms of the time. And the instruction was that any person that enters the lab, she has to flip a coin, and that person gets either treated or not treated throughout the day. And that was the procedure throughout the day. We invited the people in the interval of 1 hour or 1 hour and 15 minutes, perhaps 1 hour and 15 minutes, I think. So there would be time for a break or coffee break for the RA. And that was done from the morning all the way to the afternoons, not starting too early in the morning, first because students hate more early morning, and also because, again, cortisol is very diurnal, and we didn't want to get them as, it's really around 12, more or less, when we wake up, and after about an hour and a half, 2, it drops down to 3. And it goes close to 0 when we go to sleep. So we wanted to avoid that original peak. We wanted to avoid people. We told people not to smoke an hour before entering the procedure, not to chew bubble gum, and not to eat in the last hour before, only water in the hour before the experiment. So those are some of the controls. I suspect that most students had no idea that who Milgram was, because our students, they were first-year students. We recruited them in the first few weeks of class, and most of our students are not double major with psychology. So even if they take social psychology, usually they take social psychology in the second semester of their psychology studies. And I think from around 100 students, maybe I have 5 students who are doubly majoring in psychology and political science. But then again, that would be the second semester, so they don't know nothing about social psychology unless they were reading popular culture, kind of popular science books on their own. But again, we didn't have it wasn't like a lab. So the RA is not wearing an apron or a robe. She's just like, hey, I'm just like, she looks like your TA. So she's a TA actually for another class that they're taking. So she looks quite innocent and not threatening in any way. And I think that flew okay. I don't think people were too suspected. And again, from talking to them after, we didn't see any signs of individuals saying, I knew you were fooling me, or I knew this was not the case.
Okay. Hey, there's a question here in the room from Michael.
Yes, thanks. Really interesting and creative research. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit more about this cortisol measure and how it works and how you have to design your research design, basically. Because I was wondering, what if people beforehand, like students, are stressing about an assignment or exam, so their cortisol is quite high already? How can you sort of like temporarily distinguish between like the manipulation and maybe something that they have beforehand, and whether you have maybe some baseline measures? And yeah, I was just curious about that.
Well, terrific question. Thank you. So the baseline is them themselves. So when they enter the lab, we asked them for, as I said, we asked them to take this, what we told them was a baseline of oxytocin, when actually it was cortisol. And then after 25 minutes or 30 minutes, because the experiment takes about 5 minutes, they give us another measure. So it doesn't really matter if they were anxious because they're about to get married, they met their mother-in-law in the morning, something that's traumatic as that. But they start with a level, and we have that level, and we have the level to follow, and any change would be associated to the experiment. So they could start very high. For instance, when I did this study of Israeli elections, and I asked people to give me cortisol before voting, we saw a tremendous variation among subjects. As I said, most people have about 12. My sister lives in the town that we did the study, and because I had the data, I had to look my sister up, and my sister at the time was around 42. And the reason it was 42 for my sister is because my brother-in-law was running for the Knesset, and she was totally hysterical about the fact that he may stop being a doctor and become a politician. But I have her measure before, and therefore I can control for that. So that wouldn't be a problem. Cortisol today, it's much easier to use as a general measure. It's called the stress hormone many times. It elevates, so if you're walking down the street and you see a cat and this cat is a puma, after 25 minutes, you're gonna have a very high cortisol. So the elevation is quite immediate. So you could use it. When we were doing it, it was still a measure that was a bit terrible to collect because they had to spit into a vial, and that took forever, and it's messy, and you have to wear gloves and whatever. But today you can actually do it just like you do a COVID test. You just take a swab and you swab it in the cheek, and you can put it, and you don't even have to refrigerate it. When we were doing it, you had to refrigerate at -20. It was a whole procedure thing to get it to the lab in -20 to analyze it. Today, you can actually buy kits that are in preserved material. You can send them by mail to the US or to other labs. The best ways, the cheapest way, I would say, is to collaborate with somebody who has such a lab, and he becomes one of the co-authors. That's what we did with Hagit. She really enjoyed it because she's a lefty kind of political person. And she said, yeah, I want to do something political and not just rats. So she gave us her lab to analyze the results. So that could be a bit cheaper. Another thing that you can do now with cortisol is many people are studying cortisol not as something that is immediate, but a kind of like a measure of stress, overall stress. And you can take just one piece of hair. I don't have any, but you can take from other people a piece of hair, and you can just put it in an envelope, and you send it along to the lab, and you can get how stressful that person was in the last couple of weeks. That's also a measure that you can do today. But that will be for a different, obviously, design. It's not a pre and post. It's something that you can do, let's say, currently there's a chance in Ukraine, let's say in Ukraine, and you're thinking that perhaps in the Ukraine, because of the events of the last couple of weeks, people there are stressed. You can actually take people's hair from the last week and see if they actually feel threatened on a physiological level.
Thanks a lot for these clarifications. Natalie Giger has a question.
Yeah, just I have a question on your first study with the corruption. So you said that you also don't want to check on the covariates of co-option, and it went a bit fast to me. So you found that the right-wingers and the men are more co-opt, but do you have any measures not on other traits? So there's also some work now that I know that saying that maybe the more kind of co-opt predispositioned people then also are more likely to become politicians.
So we had measures of self-reported measures of corruption that didn't work, and that I think I'm sure that that you guys are doing, at least from my hot politics viewing, you're doing kind of similar things. The self-report sometimes is just unreliable, whereas sometimes the behavioral measure or the physiological measure can tell you something different. So for instance, in some studies that we did on voting and cortisol, we found that people told me, I'm not stressed at all. Like the PANAS-P, positive affect, negative affect of my sister was flat, like it was nothing. I'm feeling nothing. I'm like completely, and she was the third most excited person or a stressed person in the crowd that day. So we have measures of people saying, I believe that stealing is wrong. If I were to find a wallet, I would return it, things like that. But we couldn't find any correlates with that. It just didn't work.
Great. I'm going to give the floor to Bert. There's a question.
Yes, thanks, Israel. So regarding, let's start with the first study. I really like this idea of trying to get people to do something and have some behavioral indicator that they actually did this, rather than suggesting whether they would do this, especially with the sensitive behavior. I was wondering, but this is like looking at the distribution of these two these histograms in that first plot, is you now estimate two main effects, right? So corruption story and financial incentive. But what about, did you test the interaction between the two? Because it seemed actually that the mean in the corruption story without financial incentives was lower than in the, so that the signs were opposite in the two different conditions, financial consensus or not. So I was
it was a bit higher, just slightly higher for the corruption condition in both, but it was really low. So we are, the nice thing about this design is that Moran, for Americans at least, she sounds a bit like Danish or from the Netherlands. So we have another.
Nothing wrong with that, right?
No. Some of my best friends are Danish, or Netherlands. So the nice thing about it is that we already shot the same exact ads as if they were shot in Lincoln, Nebraska, actually Omaha, Nebraska. That's thanks to my work with the guys at Nebraska. I said that's going to be perfect because nobody in Nebraska would ever think that accent is not somebody from New York. That's the way people in New York probably talk. She has a bit of an Israeli accent, but people wouldn't notice it. And we gave her a name to begin with. We called her, I think, like, I don't know, Bridget Svensson or something, and she's doing the news. And instead of being the accident happening in the Negev in Israel, it happens in I-90 in Omaha. And it's exactly the same design. We're about to run it in the next couple of months. And we're going to do it in the United States, the same. So we are controlling for the presenter, for the media presented. It's the same clips. We're using the same clips for both. So the only thing that's different is the language. And obviously we say Omaha instead of the Negev, but other than that, the text is exactly the same. So I wonder what we'll find there. That's going to be I think a good addition to it.
Yeah, so one thought is to maybe think a little bit about, the effects seem small, so to bring enough observations to the study to reliably detect these small observations, so that you give the ID the best chance of succeeding.
I think you're completely correct. I think that 100 per condition was a bit modest. It was Moran's thesis. So, but now that she's expanding it to her PhD, so we definitely need to think bigger and larger. And she's currently actually preparing for doing some behavioral experiments in corruption in Argentina. They're going to be complementary to this in situations that you probably know of, policemen bribing policemen and things like that. So we're going to go down there to do some of those stuffs too.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think this is fascinating. And just very briefly on the second study, you said, well, you scared people, right, for something that to happen, and then you have these measures on the outcome variables, some policy attitudes. Would part of the explanation be for not finding these effects of the threat treatment on the outcome, that how I understand sort of the Huddy and Feldman 9/11 work is that as anxiety doesn't lead to a lot of sort of hawkish attitudes. It's the case when you start to experience anger that you want to get at so this might be for some, but the appraisal of this threatening event might lead to different effects for some and others. And could that be an explanation of why sort of on average the attitudes sort of cancel out and don't differ from the control condition?
I think you're completely right on that. Anxiety and anger do behave differently. We have another study. I'll be happy to send you guys the other study in which we have an attack on water infrastructure in Israel. So it's a report. It's a newscast report in which we directed with an actor, and we tell them there are certain conditions. And one condition is just 2 kids, feel sick. But in the other condition, 2 kids die, or some elderly die. I don't remember exactly the wording, but then I think it could lead to anger. So if the story there was that 20 times more the chlorine measure was infected in the water and people got sick and died. And this is coming from Iran. And actually, the nice thing about that design is that we had exactly such an attack from Iran. So it's imitating life.
Yeah, no, excellent. Hey, it's almost 4:00, so I'm gonna wrap up. I want to thank you for this wonderful presentation. This has a lot of the stuff that we like, right? Innovative designs, good research questions, and you tell it like it is. So thanks a lot for this. Last minute to announce a couple of the exciting speakers that we have in the coming weeks. Next week, Christel van Eck, who is my colleague at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research, will give a talk on online climate change polarization. The week after, Amélie Godefroy from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology will talk about her work on terrorism and the attitudes towards outgroups. The week after, February 18th, we have Maaike Homan, who will talk about the consequences of emotional politicians, a conjoint experiment, and Chiara Fiali, who did her master's at the University of Amsterdam and is now a PhD student at the University of Bern, will give a talk on personality and political information consumption. And we have an exciting list of speakers for the rest of the semester, so definitely check out our website, pay attention to our newsletter for the upcoming talks. And I want to thank you all for joining us today, and wish you all a pleasant weekend. So see you later, hopefully next week.
Thank you, Bert. And